Hi everyone, welcome back. I hope you're all doing well. Oh my God, brace yourselves for this one. This case is intense. The research, oh my God. This case has to be some of my craziest cases that I've covered rolled into one. Today's case is literally a mixture of Rock Terrio from the Anthill Kids, Shelley Notek, and Bala from the crazy British cult, the British cult that didn't really have a name. All of those cases rolled into one, and that is what we have today. Because today we are covering a cult, a crazy cult from Australia. And I'm pretty sure the majority of you will have never heard about this case before. And today's cult is very different from a lot of cults out there. And the main reason why it is so different is because the cult leader is a woman, Anne Hamilton Byrne. And Anne Hamilton Byrne has to be one of the most evil women that has ever come out of Australia. She also has to be one of the most evil mothers, even though she's not really a mother, but she tries to be in a very sick way.
Hamilton Byrne, Mari Moore from Channel 9. You got any comment now about why you kept those children locked away for so long?
And she was in charge of the biggest, most notorious, and most evil cult in Australia, known as the Family.
You're not smart enough.
For what?
In your heart.
And Anne, let me just give you a quick rundown. She was incredibly vain. She was yoga loving. Yeah, yoga gets involved in today's case. Of course it does. She was a multi-millionaire and born again Jesus Christ. Yeah.
Do you think you have spiritual powers?
I don't think I have spiritual powers.
And on top of all of that, she stole babies. Yeah, I'm just going to drop that on you right now. She stole babies. She stole babies.
Why did you do that?
I love children.
Because she wanted the perfect little family, aka why the cult is called the Family.
This is the moment of rebirth upon a new planet.
God, I don't even know where to start. You will be infuriated by this case. This case will make your blood boil. You will be so angry, especially at the ending of this case. So we have a hell of a lot to get through today. This is going to be a pretty long video, so let's not delay anymore and let's jump in. Oh, and seeing as we're doing a case from Australia, I feel like it is appropriate again to give the public service announcement to let you all know that I am not from Australia. I know most of you know this by now, but I still do get comments. Where is she from? Is she from Australia? No, I'm sorry. I'm not from Australia. I am British. So Anne Hamilton Byrne was actually born Evelyn Grace Victoria Edwards. Yeah, she wasn't even born Anne. She changes her name later on in the case, but I'm just going to call her Anne from the very beginning, otherwise it's going to get confusing. And she was born on the 30th of December 1921, making her a Capricorn. She grew up in a small farming town in Sale, which is just outside of Melbourne in Australia. She lived there with her parents, Florence and Ralph, and she was the oldest out of 7 children. Now, Anne did not have a very happy or stable home life. First of all, her father, Ralph, was absent. He was just nowhere to be seen, really. He had no interest in being a father. He would just show up every now and again, and it literally was like he would show up, get his wife pregnant, and then disappear again. And I'm not even joking there. So growing up, Anne didn't really see her father that much. And then Anne's mom, Florence, she was actually British. She was born in South London, and she had a lot of struggles herself. She was a self-proclaimed medium. She would claim that she could talk to the dead. And she was also diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. And for the majority of her life, she was in and out of psychiatric hospitals. And she would be seen out in the streets acting very bizarrely. Like there was one time where she was in the streets and she set her own hair on fire. So Anne's childhood was chaotic and very unstable. And Anne being the oldest, she actually had had to pretty much raise her 6 younger siblings. And she spent most of her childhood in and out of orphanages because her parents just weren't around. And then at the age of 8, Anne enrolled into a primary school in the suburbs of Melbourne. And following this, she pretty much drops off the radar. Like, I actually don't know anything about Anne's childhood from this moment on until she reaches the age of 20. But I do wonder what else happened, because Anne definitely turns into a very, very evil person. So we now get to 1941, and Anne is currently 20 years old. And this is when she decided that she wanted a fresh start. She wanted to move away from her troubled family and start on her own, stand on her own 2 feet, make her own way in life. And she started to fantasize about what her life would be like. She wanted to live a very glamorous life, a very wealthy life. And she started to have this picture of the perfect family. She wanted lots of children. She wanted lots of happy children. She basically was fantasizing about a life that was the complete opposite of her childhood. And it was around the age of 20 that Anne enters into a relationship with a man called Lionel Harris. And the two of them settle down. They buy a really nice house in Victoria. They get married. They have their first child together, which is a daughter called Judith. And you know, Anne seems to be getting everything that she wants. This is her dream. This is what she's been fantasizing about. She has the house, she has the white picket fence, she has the husband, she has the child. But things did not stay like that at all, because Anne was now in her 30s, and Anne and her husband wanted to adopt a child. They wanted to expand their family. They had arranged an adoption with a local children's home, and Lionel sets off to the children's home to pick up the child. But on his way to pick up the child, he is involved in a car crash and he is killed. I know, it's like, what are the chances? So now, because he has been killed, the children's home, they pull out of the adoption because they don't want a single parent to adopt a child. So literally in an instant, Anne's vision, her whole fantasy has been taken away from her. She's lost her husband and she's also lost a child. She was just unconsolable in grief. She was absolutely devastated that her world had literally crumbled around her. To be honest, I feel like now, just sitting here, I feel like it's now dawning on me that in Anne's mind, she tried to go about adopting children the legal way, the right way, and it didn't work out for her. And I feel like that is actually pretty important. But we are now in the 1960s, and Anne is a bit lost. She doesn't really know what to do with her life. She is now a single parent to her daughter Judith, and she just has no idea where she's supposed to go in life now. What is she supposed to do? Well, she decides to create herself a new identity. Remember, she was born with the name Evelyn. Well, now she was like, I don't want to be Evelyn anymore. I'm going to create this new identity for myself. I am going to become Anne Hamilton. And then second of all, this is when Anne discovered yoga. Oh yeah, this is a yoga cult that we have on our hands today. Why is it always yoga? What is it about yoga and cults? Seriously, guys, if any of you go to yoga class, just be vigilant, please. Please promise me, be vigilant. So this was the 1960s, and yoga was becoming the rage in Western countries. And Anne attended her first yoga class and she was hooked. The yoga class was led by a woman who had traveled all over the world and learned yoga from some of the best gurus in India. She had lived in caves and meditated for hours on end. So Anne really threw herself into the yoga world. She started learning about all of these Eastern philosophies, spiritual teachings, about connecting with a higher power. And the more and more that Anne dived into this world, the more obsessed she became. And following this, Anne became a yoga teacher herself. But in Anne's yoga classes, they were a little bit more preachy. than maybe your average yoga class. And Anne would preach about all of the things that she had learned about spirituality, about a higher power, and she would fascinate her students, because this is something that you need to know about Anne's personality, is that she was very confident, and confidence takes you so far. And Anne's students were pretty much obsessed with her. They would hang on to every single word that she would say. So Anne was a yoga teacher in this yoga school. Would you call it a yoga school? I don't know. But Anne was a yoga teacher for a few years, and as the years went by, let's just say it all went to her head, and her teachings and her preaching would become more and more extreme. And some of her teachings became a little bit controversial. So the yoga school kicked her out. They were like, yeah, Anne, this is not what we do here. Get out. Now, Anne wasn't having any of this. She was like, oh no, you cannot kick me out. If you kick me out, I will start my own yoga school. I'll show all of you. And that is exactly what happened. And this is literally cult 101. This always happens in cults. Well, not all cults, but pretty much all cults. Someone will join a religion or an organization and they'll rise to the top. And then they'll start preaching and their views will start becoming more and more extreme. And then that person will get kicked out of the religion or the organization. And then that person forms their own religion or their own organization, their own secret club. That literally is what happens in every single cult. And that is exactly what is happening now. And this is literally the beginning of Anne's cult. So once Anne had started her own yoga school, or should we just call it a cult from now, the majority of Anne's students followed her. Anne had portrayed herself as this godlike figure. She had managed to captivate her followers. People would hang on her every word. People did think that Anne was a higher being, that she was on a different level to a regular person. And I think it was now that she realized how much power and influence that she could have over people. So first of all, she starts filling her followers' heads with nonsense. Now, this always gets me. I'm like, how the hell did anyone believe this? But she started telling her followers that she was a descendant from French royalty. It's like, how did anyone believe this? But they did. And then second, she really stepped into the occult. She would use Ouija boards with her clients, which you should not mess around with Ouija boards. No. She would teach her clients, I don't know why she's calling them clients, but she would teach her clients about the supernatural. And she would also tell people that she was a medium like her mother and she could contact the dead. And her students really did believe her. They lapped up all of this. Now, Anne would say, I don't know if she used the word immortal, but she definitely would say that she was not going to die, that she would escape death, that she was ever youthful. The fact that she was telling her followers all of this, she needed to kind of keep up the ever youthful look. So she had a lot of plastic surgery. Now, you have to remember that this is the 1960s and plastic surgery, was it even heard about? I don't know. People didn't know about it. Like nowadays, we know about it. So when Anne discovered plastic surgery, she used this to her advantage. She had so many facelifts. She had quite a few nose jobs. She would always get Botox and fillers, and she would get a lot of other procedures as well. And she would actually get plastic surgery throughout the whole of this case, but I'm not going to keep bringing up, oh, she has another facelift, oh, she has a nose job here. But just know that throughout the whole of this cult, she is constantly getting plastic surgery to make herself look younger, to make people think that she has access to the fountain of youth. And it's crazy because she has so many facelifts. I don't know how many, but I know she has quite a few. And you can see her hairline throughout this video. It gets further and further back. Because again, this is the 1960s and they literally would just pull your face back, and that included your hairline, just pulling it back. I don't know how they do facelifts nowadays, but I feel like they would probably keep your hairline where it is. I don't know. And because her followers didn't know about plastic surgery, that was something that someone could get, they truly did think that Anne was never aging. And then finally, there was one more trick that Anne had up her sleeve to get her followers completely under her control. Anne would convince the women in her yoga classes to leave their husbands. Again, we have to remember the time period that we're in right now, 1960s, and it was frowned upon to get divorced. It was frowned upon to leave your husband. Society would reject you if you had a divorce. At this point as well, because a lot of her cult, she was still teaching yoga, and it was pretty much just all women. Only women went to her yoga classes. So the only people in her cult at the moment were women. So Anne was in yoga class and she was listening to her followers complain about their husbands, but they would never leave them. They would never divorce them because it would be frowned upon. They would be shunned from society. But Anne used this to her advantage. She would say to them, leave your husbands, leave them, divorce them, come to me. No one else will accept you, but I will, and you can be happy with me. She would tell her followers that they could be a part of her family. And she has always wanted a big family, hasn't she? And this is where it starts. Be in my family. We can be this one big happy family. And I can't believe this, but her followers, they did leave their husbands, they got divorced, and they went over to Anne. They lived with Anne, they joined the family. So now we get to 1962, and Anne has, I don't know the exact number, but she has quite a few followers in her cult now, but she realizes that there is a problem. All of her followers are women, and she needs men. Again, we have to remember the time period that we're in right now. Women in the 1960s, they didn't have any power. They didn't have any voice. They didn't have any influence. And Anne knew that in order to grow her organization, her group, cult, she needed men. And Anne had the perfect man in mind. She had already set her sights on a very significant person in today's case, and that was Dr. Rayner Johnson. Now, Dr. Rayner Johnson was originally from England. He studied at the University of Oxford, where he graduated with a first-class honours degree, and then he went on to get his PhD in physics. Now, Dr. Rayner Johnson was very intelligent. I cannot stress that enough. And right now he was living in Australia with his family. He worked as a professor and he was head of a college at Melbourne University. And he was in a very, very high up position at this university. He was very powerful. He was very influential. And he had a lot of connections with other very powerful, influential people. So he was of great interest to Anne. But there was one other thing about Dr. Johnson that greatly interested Anne, and that was that he was also interested in the supernatural world. Dr. Johnson was fascinated with the paranormal, with clairvoyance, with Eastern philosophy. And of course, we know that these are all things that Anne is also interested in. So she knew that she would be able to get Dr. Johnson on her side. However, there was one problem. How was she going to get him on board? She had never even spoke to him. She didn't really know him. But Anne knew that she had to have Dr. Johnson because of his position, his power, his influence. He would be the perfect man to help her build this cult, to make it bigger. So she thought, okay, I need to impress this man. I need to impress him and make him join my cult. So I am going to predict his future, because obviously Dr. Johnson was obsessed with clairvoyance. But how was she going to do this? Because she knew nothing about him. Well, Anne obviously had a plan for this. So Anne decides to sleep with Dr. Johnson's gardener. And she was going to sleep with his gardener to get information out of him about Dr. Johnson so then she could predict his future. I know. What the hell? And the gardener literally just spills his guts about Dr. Rayner Johnson, all about him, about his future, about his plans, where he's traveling, etc. And Anne has hit the jackpot. So Anne knocks on the door of Dr. Johnson's home. He opens the door and Anne says to him, "You don't know who I am, but I know who you are. I'm a clairvoyant. And she says to Dr. Johnson, you and your wife are about to take a trip to India, and your wife will become seriously ill on that trip. So at this point, Dr. Johnson is kind of like, what the hell has just happened? But he does go on a trip with his wife, and his wife does get seriously ill on that trip to India. His wife had developed a severe bad stomach, and she was pretty ill. So Dr. Johnson was like, oh my God, that woman, she was a clairvoyant. She has been able to predict my future. She said that my wife would become ill in India, and she has. I just find this hilarious because Anne's prediction wasn't exactly groundbreaking, was it? It's well known that tourists, when they visit India, they come in contact with bacteria that their bodies are not used to, and they become ill. But Dr. Johnson was convinced. He was like, oh my God, I've met a real clairvoyant. Now, even though Dr. Johnson was very intelligent, there is no denying that he was very naive. He was very gullible, and he wanted to believe in Anne, so he did. He started to believe that Anne was Jesus Christ herself, and he pledged his loyalty to Anne. He would literally follow Anne to the ends of the earth. And this is when Dr. Rayner Johnson became the first male member of the cult. So we now get to 1963, and Dr. Johnson and his wife are full members of the cult. And this is really where the cult starts to expand and become an actual cult. So this is where they give themselves a name, because every cult has to have a name. So it is really Dr. Johnson and Anne, they are kind of co-founders of this cult, and they decide to call their cult the Great White Brotherhood. Yeah, you heard that right. The first name of this cult was the Great White Brotherhood. And they obviously do change their name to the family later down the line. But yeah, the Great White Brotherhood. And following this, Dr. Johnson used his power, his influence, his connections to recruit new members. It really was in the recruitment stage right now. It was grow, grow, grow. Gotta make this cult as big as possible. He was literally on the campaign trail, and he would say that there is this amazing woman teaching yoga. She can perform miracles. And a lot of the connections he had were men, but then these men would go back, they would tell their wives, oh, you should go to this yoga class by this amazing woman who can perform miracles called Anne. And it wasn't long before all of these lawyers, businessmen, politicians, doctors, all of them were attending Anne's yoga classes. And they weren't really even yoga classes right now. They literally would just go and listen to Anne preach that she was the female reincarnation of Jesus Christ. Yeah, that is actually what she would say. And she would perform miracles. And how did she perform miracles, you ask? Well, first of all, she had started to get a load of doctors in the cult. And what could doctors do? Get their hands on medication. And she would get these doctors to poison cult members, and they would become really, really ill. And in these sermons, Anne would bring up this patient who was very sick, very ill, and she would cure them, but she wouldn't actually cure them. The doctor would just stop poisoning them. But no one knew that these people were actually being poisoned. So in their eyes, this was a miracle. This person is completely cured. And then there was another huge part of the cult that convinced people that Anne did have powers, and that was drugs. Yeah, there was a lot of drugs in this cult, and a lot of LSD. That was the drug of choice for this cult. Anne had recently recruited a man called Dr. Lance Whitaker, and he was big on LSD, the effects of LSD, what you could do with it, how people would react to it. So when new members joined the cult, they had to go through this initiation ceremony where they were essentially pumped with LSD. They were then left in a dark room, no light, nothing, for hours on end, and they were completely high on LSD. They were completely tripping out, and all of a sudden Anne would appear. She would be dressed in white robes, robes. There would be a single spotlight on her. There would be a smoke machine. I feel like in my head there is also a wind machine, and she would tell new members that she was Jesus Christ. Now you have to remember that the people witnessing this, they are high on LSD, they are completely out of it, and you can picture it, can't you? Anne with her blonde hair billowing in the wind, the smoke machine, the white robes, the single spotlight. And because the new cult members were high on drugs, they believed this. They truly believed that they were having a vision, that Anne was Jesus Christ. And it was that simple to convince people that Anne was this almighty being, that she was godlike, that she was the second coming of Jesus. It was literally just drugs. So Anne is really taking advantage of the fact that she has doctors in her cult, and honestly, that is terrifying, but it doesn't end there. Oh no, it gets scarier. So Dr. Johnson introduces a woman to Anne, and her name is Joy, and Joy owns a psychiatric hospital. Now Joy, she was coming to the end of her life, and Anne decided to take advantage of that. Anne worked her magic and managed to get Joy to change her will to leave Anne the psychiatric hospital when she died. I honestly don't know how Anne seems to have this much power and control over people. I mean, when I was doing my research, I kept seeing the same things over and over again. She's very charming and charismatic, and her beauty just transfixes people. So Joy does pass away, and Anne is now the owner of a private psychiatric hospital, and oh boy does she use this to her advantage. Because you might be thinking, well, what is she planning with the psychiatric hospital? How much damage could she actually cause with that? Well, at this time in Australia, you only needed the signature of 2 doctors to get someone committed to a psychiatric hospital. And guess who Anne has full control over in her cult? Loads of doctors. Meaning that Anne could essentially get any of the doctors that are in her cult, just 2 of them, to sign someone and get them committed, involuntarily committed to this psychiatric hospital. Now, if that is not terrifying, I don't know what is. Because, spoiler, that is exactly what happens to multiple people. Anyone that threatened the cult, anyone that threatened to expose the cult, anyone that disagreed with Anne, or anyone that was going to get in the way of Anne getting what she wanted, would get committed to the hospital. And I truly cannot believe that she was allowed to get away with this. I mean, of course she's allowed to get away with this. She actually has doctors, real doctors, signing these things and getting people committed. So we now get to 1968. The cult, as a proper cult, has been running for approximately 5 years at this point. Anne is currently 47 years old, even though she's telling everyone that she's in her 30s. And this is when a very significant thing happens, because she meets a man called Bill Byrne. Now, Bill was roughly the same age as Anne, her real age. And the moment Anne met Bill, she knew that she had to have him. That was going to be her next husband. However, there was one problem. Bill was already married. Happily married with 4 children. But did this stop Anne? Oh no, of course it didn't, because she had a psychiatric hospital that she would get people committed to. I know, it's unbelievable. So as soon as Anne and Bill met, Bill became infatuated with her. He became obsessed with her. He would do anything for her, and he wanted to leave his wife for Anne. So what did Anne do? She got Bill's wife committed to the psychiatric hospital. Yeah, in order to get rid of Bill's wife, she got her sectioned, and she was pumped full of drugs. She was starved. She was left in a dark room. She had to go through humiliating, degrading, invasive treatments. Treatments that she obviously didn't need either, because there was nothing wrong with her. And Bill left his wife. Just like that, Anne married Anne. And also Bill abandoned his 4 children. He didn't care about them anymore. And when I got to this point in my research about this hospital and about the doctors in the cult and the doctors committing people that don't need to be committed to the psychiatric hospital, I just kept thinking, oh my God, this is a horror film. This literally sounds like American Horror Story Asylum. And I think this is what makes this cult so different to a lot of other cults, because obviously it's very common, of course it is, for the cult leader to have a lot of control over their followers, like Anne does. However, normally the people that are in the cult, that are following the cult leader, don't have that much power or influence or money themselves. But that is what makes this cult different, because the members of Anne's cults are lawyers, doctors, business people, politicians. And it's just scary how one person can control all of these other very powerful, influential people. So now that Anne has her new husband, Bill Byrne, and that's obviously why Anne's name is Anne Hamilton Byrne, the cult continues to grow. And at this point, the cult had grown and now has 500 members. Yeah, this is no little cult. This is a huge cult. 500 members, all middle class, wealthy, powerful, and they would all gather weekly, take LSD, and watch Anne give her rambling sermons that she was powerful, almighty, she could perform miracles, that she was the second coming of Jesus Christ. She would talk about contacting spirits, help people get in contact with their dead loved ones, and her followers would worship her. They would kneel at her feet in admiration. And they did kind of have their little village, this little cult village. Most of the cult members bought properties in the same area in a place called Ferny Creek, which is just outside of Melbourne, and all of the cult members would live together in this like little village. It wasn't obviously a dedicated village to this cult, but they would all buy properties in this area. And these houses that the cult members lived in were pretty fancy. Like I said, most of the members were rich. And this is really where this cult that Anne has really does become a cult, because Anne, she wants to make money. She wants to be wealthy herself. So Anne starts to demand 10% of the wages of all of the cult members, which 10% of approximately 500 cult members adds up, which meant that Anne soon became a multi-millionaire. And finally, something else that Anne did that is just completely classic cult is that she would make the cult members swap spouses. But it's just a complete power trip, isn't it? To make people swap spouses and to have that much control over people is exactly what Anne wanted. And you might be thinking, okay, so why are they doing this? Like, why are they so transfixed by Anne? Why are they completely under her spell? And this is where Anne really did have people convinced that she was the second coming of Jesus Christ. And Anne, in her sermons, would tell people that they had a huge karmic debt. And they needed to repay this debt to reach the afterlife, to reach heaven. And if they didn't pay off this debt, they would come back in the next life, and their next life would be worse off than the current life that they have right now. So how did these people repay the debt? Well, that was simple. That was the simplest thing of all. To repay their karmic debt, they just needed to do everything that Anne said. That simple. They just needed to do everything that Anne said. And they thought to get to heaven, they needed to do everything that she wanted. And what would happen if they didn't obey Anne? Well, they would be punished. And their punishments would be either committed to the psychiatric hospital, or, and this is just completely sick, they would have brutal operations carried out on them by one of the doctors. Like, there was this one man that wanted to leave the cult, and in order to stop him from doing this, Anne ordered a frontal lobe lobotomy. How are these words coming out of my mouth? How did this actually happen? And I'm sure most of you know what a lobotomy is, but they basically just drilled into the front of his brain. And this changed his personality forever, like completely forever, just because he wanted to leave the cult. And finally, there is one more thing that happened in this cult that really did just make this a classic cult. Anne said the end of the world was happening. Why is it that all cults do this? Yes, this was a doomsday cult as well. Anne told her followers that the apocalypse was approaching. And she really did play on people's fear that nuclear war was about to break out worldwide. Like, people genuinely did believe this. The Cold War was currently going on. There was also the Cuban Missile Crisis. Like, people genuinely did believe that nuclear war was on the brink. And Anne would tell people that if they were in this cult, they would be saved from the apocalypse. But also, after the apocalypse, they would need to repopulate the planet. Could you get more stereotypical cult? I mean, seriously. So in order to repopulate the planet, they needed children, and they needed to create the master race. And this is where we get to the point in the story where Anne's cult really does go into overdrive, because we have talked about so much tragedy already in this case. We have talked about people being committed to a psychiatric hospital, people being operated on just because they want to leave a cult. Well, now we are going to be talking about how Anne stole 28 children. And it was now when Anne started to collect children that she changed the name of the cult to The Family. So we are now entering into the 1970s. Anne is in her 50s. Now, Anne can't have any more children because she's had a hysterectomy and she has one child of her own, but she wants a big family. She wants loads of children. But having children herself wasn't an option. And she wasn't about to go down the legal route again because that didn't pan out very well the last time. So now she's going to steal children. She's going to go down the illegal route and steal them, just take them. And I really do mean just stealing babies. Now, you may have images of Anne literally running around Australia stealing babies, and it didn't quite happen like that, because we have to remember, I know I'm a broken record, but she has doctors in her cult. And this is what makes this cult so scary. And the way Anne went about stealing these children is honestly just terrifying, because she wanted to do it in a way that she wasn't going to get caught. So her trusty psychiatric hospital comes in handy once again. Because whenever a patient would be in the psychiatric hospital and they were pregnant, Anne would arrange for the doctors at the hospital to deliver the baby and then essentially steal the baby for Anne. Yeah, these poor mothers, most of the time they were teenagers. They were deemed unfit to be a mother because they were a teenager, because they were a single mom having a child out of wedlock. They were in the psychiatric hospital, and because they were deemed unfit to be a mother, their child would be taken away from them. Now, this actually wasn't exclusive just for Anne. This actually did happen. This happened in this country, in the UK as well. It's absolutely disgusting. But Anne would take advantage of the fact that society at the time frowned upon teenage pregnancy and children out of wedlock. So whenever a patient would be in the psychiatric hospital and they were about to give birth, they would give birth and then a pillow would be placed over their head so they didn't even see their baby. The baby would be whisked out the room and then put up for adoption or given to Anne. And that mother would never ever even see her baby. And Anne stole multiple babies this way, taking advantage of vulnerable young mothers. And she didn't just steal babies from her psychiatric hospital. She had a huge network of doctors that would literally keep an eye out for teenage pregnancy. And whenever a teenager would become pregnant, they would essentially try and steal their baby. And in a few instances, they were successful. In Australia, and I'm pretty sure that it happened in the UK as well, when a teenage girl would fall pregnant, they were sent away. So nobody in the neighborhood, the community would know that that girl was pregnant. So they would be sent away to have the baby, and then they would come back childless, and no one would know that they had had a baby. But that baby was then put up for adoption, or in today's case, stolen by Anne. And because she had lawyers on her side as well, the lawyers were able to forge and create birth certificate and adoption records, everything. And then on top of this, because she wanted even more children, whenever any of the cult members would fall pregnant, she would convince them to hand their baby over to her. So the cult members that willingly gave over their children, they would literally from afar watch their own children be raised, but those children wouldn't know that they are their biological parents. Does that make sense? This is crazy. And over the course of the 70s, so over a decade, Anne stole 28 children. 14 of them she stole from the psychiatric hospital or vulnerable young mothers, and the other 14 she stole from other cult members. I just cannot believe this. Now, again, this is nothing uncommon for cults. Pretty much all cults, they want to repopulate the world. The end of the world is happening. They want lots of children. But normally the cult leader is a man, and the man gets lots of the women in the cult pregnant and has multiple children by multiple women at the same time. Whereas Anne, she can't do that. She has to think of a different way to go about this. So she steals them. And these children are raised thinking that Anne is their biological mother and Bill is their biological father. All of the people in the cult, obviously apart from the people that willingly gave over their children and the people that are on the inside helping her, like the doctors and the lawyers, but all of the other members of the cult did believe that these 28 children were biologically Anne's. And in order to keep up this ruse, Anne would be constantly pregnant. She would wear a fake baby bump. She would wear maternity clothes, and people fell for it. She would tell them that she's had lots of sets of twins and triplets to explain the large number of children that she was having.
How many pregnancies do you think she would have gone through?
She seemed to be pregnant all the time. Just one after the other, plus she had triplets.
Did you ever see her actually pregnant?
I never felt her stomach.
And I just don't know how anyone believed that roughly over the space of a decade, Anne popped out 28 children. Now, eventually, when these children grew up, they needed to go to school. And she also had connections in the education system. So Anne decided to open up her own school. So yeah, Anne registered a school at her cult. I feel like I'm speechless so many times in this video because how was she allowed to get away with this? She opened up her own school, and this is what is so scary about this cult. She has connections in every single industry. And ultimately, this is her goal. This is the goal of the cult for Anne, to become wealthy, to have power, and to have a big family and a lot of children. And right now, she has succeeded in all of that. And it's just crazy that she was able to open up a school and the authorities didn't question anything, because from the outside, it looked legitimate. So now Anne had her perfect little family, but the children, what was life like for these children? Well, as you can imagine, it was absolutely terrible. So first of all, Anne had to figure out where to keep all of these children because she wanted them kept secret, hidden. So she bought herself a very large property. It was in the middle of some woods, it was right by a lake, and it was really well hidden and no one could see this property. And she called this property Up Top. And this is where the children were kept, in Up Top. And this was essentially a prison. There was barbed wire fencing all around the property. None of them could escape. They were in the middle of nowhere. But then Anne had another problem on her hand because she was telling everybody that these children were all hers, that all of these children were siblings. However, they weren't, which meant that they looked different from one another. So Anne decided that she had to make all of the children look alike. They needed to look like siblings. So she decided to dye all of the children's hair platinum blonde. And she gave them all this like similar haircut. It was like a bob. It was like just below the ears. All of the girls had very long hair and all of the boys had this really short hair, and they were all forced to wear matching clothes. All of the boys would look the same. All of the girls would look the same. It looks like a mixture of the Von Trapp family mixed with the children from the Village of the Damned.
I wanted them to look like brothers and sisters, though. I must admit this. I love them. I love them in their little smocks and jeans and the long hair and ribbons. It was beautiful. It was lovely to see.
And dyeing their hair was a horrible experience for the children because it would burn. Some of the children were allowed to keep their natural colour hair if it was red or like a light browny blonde, because that could pass as a sibling hair colour. But if the child had really dark hair, it had to be dyed. And on top of that, the children had to be given speech lessons where they were forced to practice pronouncing their vowels so they sounded more British than Australian. I don't really know why she wanted her children to have a British accent. I don't know. So now Anne really did have her perfect little family, and she would make these creepy home movies to make it seem like to the outside world she really did have this perfect family.
This is the moment of rebirth upon a new planet. We've received the call, and great things will be done.
She would make all the children run around and laugh and be happy, and she would make the children sing in the choir. And she wanted this perfect family image to recruit more members, because when she was recruiting, she would show them these home videos and say, look at my children, look at the way we're living, look at how happy these children are. But of course, it wasn't perfect. The conditions that these children were living in were absolutely abhorrent. But before we get on to the actual conditions of what the children were living in, I just want to tell you some of the children's names. We don't actually know the identities of all 28 children because they haven't been revealed, but we do know the identities of some of the children. So we have Sarah, who was actually the first child to be stolen. She was taken away from her 15-year-old mom from the psychiatric hospital. Now, she was one of the moms that had the pillow put over her head and her baby taken away from her. We have Leanne as well, who was another one of the older children. Then there was Ben, who was offered up willingly by one of the cult members. Then there was Rebecca, who was Anne's biological grandchild. Now, I don't know any more details than that because obviously Anne does have one biological child called Judith. Now, clearly Judith had had a child, which was Rebecca, but Anne stole her biological grandchild. And then finally, one of the other identities that we do know of the children was Anna-Marie, who was actually stolen from one of Bill's biological sons. So remember, Bill has 4 children that he abandoned as soon as he married Anne. And one of his son's wives got pregnant, and Bill and Anne got that wife committed to the psychiatric hospital, and then they stole her baby. I know we cover some very, very dark cases on this channel, but when we cover things like this, when we cover cults and stealing children, it's just really hard to wrap your head around that this actually happened. So now we need to get back to the conditions that the children were kept in, and I'm going to warn you now, this is not very nice at all. So pretty much the first thing that Anne did to keep control and discipline the children was hire what she called aunties. So these aunties would be just other female cult members. These aunties would be the ones disciplining the children, enforcing the rules, homeschooling the children, living with the children, because Anne never wanted to get her hands dirty, so she hired other people to do it for her. And these aunties would raise the children. They would do everything. And Anne would just pop up every now and again and pretend to be the loving mother. And whenever Anne wanted the children to be disciplined, it was the aunties that carried out the discipline. Now, there was 3 main aunties, but there was more, but there was 3 main ones. And their names were Elizabeth, Trish, and Margot. They were the 3 main ones, but there were other aunties from other cult members. And what is just really crazy is that some of the aunties were the actual biological mothers of some of the children. And the children were subjected to a strict military routine. So for example, 5 a.m, wake up, wash, dress, make beds. 6:30 a.m, 1 hour of yoga. Of course, don't forget that this is a yoga cult. 7:30 a.m, listen to Anne's sermons on tape. Really, they had to do that every day. 7:45 a.m, chanting mantras. 8 a.m, meditation. 8:15 a.m, physical exercise. And then at 8:30 a.m, this is 3.5 hours after the children have woken up. Now they're allowed breakfast. They have already done so much, and now they're only allowed breakfast, which usually was just a few pieces of small fruit. The rest of their day was consisted of schoolwork and chores. They were allowed lunch and dinner, which consisted of steamed vegetables. And then they were forced back in bed by 9 p.m. to do everything all over again the next day. And this is what every day was like, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. For the majority of the time as well, there was no electricity and no running water in Uptop, meaning that there was gas fires for light. They didn't have a toilet that functioned like a normal toilet. They had to manually flush the toilet. They had to wash in buckets. And the children were not allowed access to TV. Obviously, there was no internet, but they were not allowed access to newspapers or books that told them about the outside world. They were so isolated. They had no clue what the world was like. They were forced to sleep in dormitory-style rooms, boys in one room, girls in another. They were also not allowed to be individual. They were not allowed personalities. They were not allowed belongings. And the children, the worst part of all of this, they thought that this was normal. So things have already been pretty bad already, but things are about to get so much worse because we now need to talk about how the children are punished. And given that Anne wanted complete and utter control over these children, if the children ever did step out of line, they would be punished severely. But most of the time, it would be the aunties that would dish out the punishment. Anne, like I said, never wanted to get her hands dirty, even though Anne would sometimes do the punishment. But Anne always wanted to be favoured by the children, so she would never want to punish the children herself. She would always want to make the aunties look bad, even though it was Anne calling all of the shots. So the first thing that the aunties would do to punish the children was to beat them. And these children would get beaten all of the time for the smallest of things. They were beaten if they spoke when they weren't supposed to speak. They would be beaten if they didn't get dressed quick enough. They were also only allowed to go to the toilet at certain times, which resulted in a lot of the time the children wetting themselves. So if the children ever wet themselves, they would be severely beaten. They would also be beaten for the most ridiculous small things as well, like not putting on the cap properly of the toothpaste. They would be beaten if they had messy handwriting. One of the girls was actually starved for 3 days because she wore odd socks. And these beatings were brutal. They would use their hands, but they would also use weapons like canes and metal rulers, shoes, whips, belts, even pieces of wood with nails sticking out of the end. And these children would be covered in bruises and cuts pretty much constantly, because that was the thing as well. There were so many rules and regulations that the children had to abide by, but these rules would change almost on a daily basis. The children would break a rule that they didn't even realize was a rule at the time. There was also a rule that the children couldn't be friendly towards each other. Even though they were supposed to be this big happy family, they were siblings. They were not allowed to form friendships. But if the children ever did become friendly with another child, they would be split up. There were 2 girls, Sarah and Andrea, that were actually forbidden to talk to each other for 1 year. And another thing that was severely punished was bedwetting. The children were actually not allowed to go to the toilet in the middle of the night, and they were so terrified, they were so scared. They were not allowed to wet the bed that inevitably at least one child every single night would wet the bed. Each morning the aunties would get the children up and inspect their beds to see which child had wet the bed. And when a child had wet the bed, they would be dragged by their ear to the bathroom and given an ice cold shower. They were then given a beating, and then they were forced to clean their own dirty sheets. There was one boy that wet the bed so often and was beaten so much that the other children called him Zebra Stripes, because he had so many stripes on the back of his body from being hit with a cane. But it didn't matter what age you were still not allowed to wet yourself, and that included babies. Babies that have no concept of bladder control, nothing. They were still beaten if they wet themselves. It's just, honestly, like, oh God, I feel like I'm getting emotional. Just beating a baby because they've wet themselves. It's like, who the hell does this? And also, like I said, some of these aunties, they would be the biological mothers to some of these children that they were beating. How can they do that? And the older children as well, they were forced to be complicit. They were forced to participate in punishing the younger children. So if a baby did wet themselves, sometimes the older children would be forced to punish the baby. The aunties would force the older child to hold the baby in an ice cold bath, whilst the aunties would hit the babies. I'm sorry, this is a lot, isn't it? And the baby would be screaming. The older children just had to hold the baby in the ice cold bath, and the aunties would say that the babies needed to be taught a lesson. The children were also forced to undergo intense interrogation sessions. If any of the children ever broke one of the rules, for example, breaking an ornament or leaving their bed messy, not making their bed, if the aunties didn't know which child had broken the ornament or left the room a mess, then the aunties would interrogate each child until one of the children would crack and confess either that it was themselves or snitch on one of the other children. But the children always stuck together. They had this code of silence, which meant that all the children were beaten. And these interrogation sessions, they were absolutely disgusting. The aunties would bring all of the children into one room and they would place a stool in the middle of the room, and one by one they would get each child and put them on the stool and interrogate them and shout in their face like, confess, confess. But the children never did confess, so their pants were pulled down and they were whipped in front of the other children, and the other children had to watch. And if ever any of the children would flinch or look away because they didn't want to see another child being beaten, then they would get beaten. And sometimes Anne would get involved. Anne would sometimes come into the room holding a knife. She would want to know which child had broken the rules. And she would threaten the children with a knife, and she would slam this knife on the table and she would say, confess. Confess now or I'll cut your bums off. And the children were truly terrified that this was going to happen. They were really scared of Anne. On other occasions, when the children didn't comply, their hands were held over an open flame. They would also get their heads held in a bucket of water until they would confess. They would get the child's head and shove it in the bucket, hold it there for I don't know how long, but a decent amount of time, pull the child's head out of the bucket and would say, are you ready to confess yet? And if the child didn't confess or didn't say anything, their head would be put in the bucket again, and this would continue. The children were also waterboarded. The treatment of these children is beyond disgusting. It's disgusting to think about what Anne and the aunties and Bill, don't forget about Bill, he is there, he's complicit in all of this. They are disgusting people. But it gets worse. It really does. And it's like, how? How does this get worse? Because there was another way that Anne would control the children, and that was by food. Now, I've already told you roughly what the children would eat, but they would eat a couple of pieces of fruit for breakfast, a small plate of steamed vegetables for lunch, and a small plate of steamed vegetables for dinner, and that was it. So that is already not enough for anyone to survive on. They were basically eating nothing. So these children were starving. They pretty much were being starved. There were padlocks on the kitchen cupboards so the children could never access the food. And the aunties would walk around with the keys dangling from their belt to the food cupboards just as an extra form of torment. Anne and the aunties every single day would gather and eat very nice, lavish food, and the children would just have to sit and watch and literally starve. And one of Anne's favourite punishments was to withhold food from the children, and the children would have to scavenge for food. They would look through the bins to eat anything. Some children would find mouldy bread and eat it. One girl actually had to start eating grass and leaves because she was that starving. And then another boy was forced to eat his own feces because he was that hungry. But if that wasn't bad enough, Anne's control over food went further than that because she would make the children be weighed every single day. Every morning after the children were woken up, they would be forced to stand in a line, and one by one they would step on scales. And if any of the children ever put on any weight from the day before, they would be severely beaten, which is insane because these are children. They are growing children. They, of course, are going to put on weight. But Anne was very vain. She was very particular in how she wanted people to look. She would judge people by the way they looked. And she wanted her children to be as skinny and as scrawny and malnourished really as possible, especially the girls. She was really hard on the girls. She never wanted the girls to put on any weight. And if any of the children did put on any weight, their food was rationed. They were given half of what they were previously getting, which was still basically nothing. And there is one girl, Cassandra, and her story is just truly heartbreaking because she was a very young child. She was under 10. I don't know her exact age, but she had started to get a distended stomach from malnutrition. Now, the other children knew that this was from malnutrition because the children did have access to textbooks because of their education. They were allowed medical textbooks, and they got their textbooks and they tried to show Anne that her distended stomach was from malnutrition. She wasn't putting on weight. But Anne was not having any of this. She was like, no, Cassandra, she's putting on weight. She's putting on too much weight. So Cassandra's food kept getting restricted even more. And the other children begged Anne. They begged the aunties to give Cassandra more food. But Anne was having none of this, and she said, and I truly cannot believe that she said this, Anne said that Cassandra should never weigh more than 3 stone until she reached the height of 4 foot or more. 3 stone. 3 stone. That is severely underweight. And Cassandra got so malnourished that she was unable to walk. She literally had to crawl around on her stomach. She even started having fits. But Anne and the aunties just ignored this, and they said that Cassandra was crawling around and she was having fits for sympathy. So as well as the starvation, there was also 2 final things that Anne would do to keep control over the children. The first was drugs. Yes, Anne was also putting the children on LSD. Children as young as 8 or 9 were given LSD twice a day. They would have delusions, hallucinations, they would sweat profusely, they would shake, they would hear voices, they would be completely spaced out. And Anne would do this so they were more docile, so she could control them better. And the children were so affected by this, it really did affect their development. Some children would just sit and stare out of the window for hours and just not move. The children, most of the time when they were on LSD, they wouldn't utter a word. Their personalities just gone. They were just empty shells. And then when the children were 14 years old, they had the initiation ceremony, just like the other cult members, where they were pumped full of LSD. They were taken into a dark room for hours, and then Anne would come out with her Jesus Christ act, with her robes and the spotlight and the smoke machine. And then the final thing was targeting the girls, because Anne was always harsher on the girls. It was drummed into the girls that their changing bodies as they were hitting puberty were ugly. And when they started their periods, they were not given any pads or tampons or anything. She would also make the girls feel dirty and sexual. She would go into almost these psychotic outbursts, and she would just start screaming at the girls about their bodies. She would start saying that cancerous tumors were going to grow out of their genitalia. She would accuse the girls of being lesbians if they dressed in a certain way. She would also accuse them of walking a certain way to attract men, and these accusations would start from as young as the age of 5. Imagine shouting at a 5-year-old, saying that the 5-year-old is walking a certain way to attract men. And she very harshly judged the girls by their looks. But if any of the children were deemed more ugly by Anne, they would be treated worse. And then finally, when the children went to bed, quite often the children would rock themselves to sleep as a form of comfort. But Anne would take this as a form of sexual gratification. So if a child was ever caught rocking themselves to sleep, they would be severely beaten. And these children, especially the girls, they grew up absolutely hating themselves, absolutely hating who they were and the way they looked. And they started self-harming because they thought that they deserved it. They would pick at their skin and their skin would become infected. They would hold their breath until they fainted. They would cut themselves with pins and scissors and then rub their wounds in dirt. And then finally, Sarah repeatedly fantasized about poisoning herself with Dettol. So that is what life was like for the children, which obviously we have been talking about the children for a while, but the children are really the main part of this story. But we need to go back to the rest of the cult now. And we are now entering the 80s, and the children have been living in those conditions for about a decade at this point. But Anne in the 80s wanted to expand the cult even more. Now, by this time, Anne had amassed so much money. She was actually worth $50 million. I know, $50 million. And this was all taken from her cult members. And she used her wealth to buy multiple properties all over the world. She had a nice fancy house in the English countryside in Kent. She bought a nice fancy house in upstate New York. She also had another house in London and a house in Hawaii. And she had a few other places around the world. And Anne at this point was just using her money to travel around the world to try and recruit more people from all over the world. Yeah, this cult is now going worldwide. And surprisingly, whenever Anne would travel, she would sometimes take some of the children. Now, of course, this was no holiday for the children. The children were merely taken along to be shown off, because Anne liked to portray that she had this perfect little family. So whenever Anne was going out to recruit new people, she would take the children along, she would put them on a plane, she would fly to one of her houses, the children would be taken off the plane, into the house, locked away in the house, still treated the exact same. The aunties were also with them. They still had the exact same strict military regime, but they were just in a different house. And then when Anne would entertain new people, try to lure new people into the cult, she would get her children out. They would be in their best clothes. They would be lined up, and she would just parade them like a traveling circus. Look at my perfect children all lined up. Look at how well behaved they are. And each children was made to kiss both Anne and Bill on each cheek, which would normally be forbidden because the children were never allowed to show Anne affection. And Anne never showed them any affection either. But in front of guests, they were allowed to show affection because Anne wanted to portray this perfect family. But then Anne would sometimes travel alone because, you know, she needed a break from running this big worldwide cult. It was hard work. And she would leave the children up top with the aunties. But Anne was still sadistic, even though she was thousands of miles away. Because whenever the children were punished, whenever the children were beaten, Anne would phone up and listen. Yeah, she liked to listen to the children crying and screaming in pain. And it's just crazy that this cult just continued on. Whenever Anne was in Australia, she continued to deliver her rambling sermons. The cult members would all take LSD. Dr. Johnson is still really a part of the cult, by the way. He is always there trying to recruit new people, trying to make new connections. And there was new tactics that Anne was using to keep her cult members in line. Because obviously this cult now has been going on for, it's got to be like 20 years at this point. But of course, being in a cult for 20 years, some people are going to wake up and want to leave. However, Anne never allowed that to happen because when she would deliver her sermons, she would give her cult members LSD. And whilst the cult members were high and spaced out, Anne would interrogate them and get them to reveal their deepest, darkest secrets. So whenever these cult members would want to leave, Anne would blackmail them. And I think it's crazy when you think about how many members there are in this cult. We don't know the exact number, but it is 500 plus members. It is so rare that a cult of this size and has been going on for so long has remained hidden. But then again, the motto of the cult was unseen, unknown, unheard. So everything seems to be going great for Anne right now. She has this huge cult. She is a multi-millionaire. She has properties all over the world and she has her perfect little family. But as we move through the 1980s, this is when things would finally start to go downhill. So the first thing that went wrong, this literally shook Anne to her core. A young child in the local area went missing, and the kidnapping was blamed on the cult. People in the local area that obviously were not in the cult had started to notice the cult and all of the strange things that were happening, and as soon as this child went missing, they pointed the finger at Anne. Now, Anne didn't actually kidnap this child. I know, shock horror, I bet you were thinking that she did. But no, Anne did not kidnap this child. But regardless, this still brought unwanted attention to Anne and the cult. And the police arrive at Uptop to search the premises. Now, you're probably thinking, great, the police are here, this is when the children get rescued. Unfortunately, that does not happen right now because Anne had prepared for this scenario and she had gotten the aunties to dig out a section of the house that it was kind of like in between the walls, and it was known as the hole, and you entered into the hole through a cupboard. And then it was just the space in between the walls. It was very small, very cramped. And whenever visitors would come to the property that didn't know about the children, and obviously the police have now arrived, all of the children were put in the hole. So when the police searched up top, there was no children to be found. And all of the children, when they were in the hole, they kept silent. Because you've got to realize that these children have been raised in this cult. They know nothing other than this cult. And they had always been taught that outsiders, especially people like the police, they were told that the police wanted to rape and kill them. So that is why the children stayed quiet, because they were terrified of the police. So the police left and the children were not saved. However, this is very significant because from this point going forward, things would keep going wrong. Because like I said, this brought a lot of attention to Anne. Media started picking up on the story of Anne and the mysterious cult. Camera crews were turning up at the meetings of the cult, trying to ambush Anne and trying to ask her questions about the cult. The media had also found out about the multiple children in the cult, and they asked Anne, "Do you abuse your children?"
Why did you start to take in the children?
Over 21 years, 28 young people went through our hands.
Why did you do that?
I love children.
But not just that, some of the cult members had even started to leave, which I know was something that Anne never allowed to happen.
We just don't want to speak to you. There's nothing to talk about. Does it concern you, the allegations former sect members have been making?
No, it doesn't concern me one bit.
Are you a follower of Mrs. Hamilton Burns?
I'm a friend of Mrs. Hamilton Burns.
Do you believe she's a teacher?
I believe she's just a great friend of mine, all right?
However, it was starting to get out of control. Multiple people wanted to leave, and ultimately Anne couldn't stop them. And then the cult members that were leaving started to talk to the media, and everything just kept getting worse and worse. And then on top of all of that, the children started to rebel, because at this point they were older now. Most of them were teenagers. Sarah and Leanne, the two oldest, were 16 and 17. The children were starving. They were completely fed up. So the children, especially Sarah and Leanne, would break out of the compound at night. They would walk to nearby houses and break into those houses to steal food. And they would steal food and bring the food back to the other children at the compound. And this went on for so long that the community that was not a part of the cult finally started to clock on that there was children at that compound. And the police were sent there again, but again the children were put in the hole. And at this point, it was now 1987. The cult had been going on for approximately 30 years. But after all of these years, Anne was nearly 66 years old, and she was tired. She was fed up. She actually didn't want to be the cult leader anymore, because Anne had gotten what she wanted. She wanted a family. She wanted all of these children. I don't think Anne ever set out to become a cult leader. I think she just wanted power and control and a family. But at this point in 1987, 1987, she just couldn't be arsed anymore. And she basically fled to her fancy mansion in upstate New York, and she barely ever returned to the compound, to the cult in Australia. But the aunties were still there at the compound. They were still controlling, abusing their children on Anne's orders, and Anne was just gallivanting around all these different countries. Leanne and Sarah were getting more and more out of control. They were breaking out of the compound more and more, and because they kept breaking out of the compound, they actually started to meet some of the other children in the community, and they made friends with two girls called Kathy and Helen. And Kathy and Helen showed Sarah and Leanne what life was like outside of the cult, how children should be raised. And Kathy and Helen's parents almost took Sarah and Leanne under their wing, and they would kind of look after them, and they would take them on their family trips. They would go shopping to the mall, they would eat McDonald's. Sarah and Leanne even started to attend dance classes. And then Leanne and Sarah would return back to the compound and talk to the other children about what the world was like. And as you can imagine, Anne, even though she can't be bothered, she is furious about this. And on the phone, she's in New York, she tells the aunties to severely punish Sarah and Leanne for doing this. But the two of them, especially Sarah at this point, they couldn't care. They knew what the outside world was like at this point, and they knew that they had to get out. So in one final act of rebellion, Sarah broke probably the number one rule of Up Top and the cult. She brought an outsider to the compound. She brought one of her friends home with her, which was like the number one rule. You cannot break that rule. Outsiders were not allowed in the cult. They were not allowed in the compound. And when Anne heard that Sarah had brought an outsider to the compound, Anne had had enough, and she kicked Sarah out. Yep, she kicked Sarah out of the cult. This was probably music to Sarah's ears. Sarah was told that she was no longer a member of the family. And Anne, over the phone, said to Sarah, quote, "You are no longer our daughter. Go out there and die in the gutter." So Sarah was kicked out. But did things end there? Of course not, because Leanne also left. She packed up her bag and followed Sarah out of the compound. And afterwards, Sarah and Leanne went to the police together, which I've got to say was so brave of both of them, because their whole life they have been told that the police are evil, that the police will rape and kill them. And once they told the police everything, Anne's world came crashing down. Because on the 14th of August 1987, something very significant happened, because the police took Sarah and Leanne's reports seriously, and they jumped straight into action. And at 7 a.m. that morning, the police stormed Up Top compound, and the other children were finally saved. First of all, the children were absolutely terrified, the other children at Up Top, because they also believed that the police were evil, that they were there to rape and kill them. So the children were actually resisting the police and trying to kick and scream at them, and they were trying to not be saved. But they were finally rescued, and the aunties that were at the compound were also arrested. Anne's other properties in Australia were also raided, and they found a ton of documentation on the cult. They also found huge stashes of LSD, and they had documents of all of the members of the cult. And you've got to realize that these members, they were pretty important, powerful, wealthy people, and pretty much everything came crashing down, and all of the cult members just started to flee. The psychiatric hospital was shut down. Finally, Dr. Whitaker, who was the one that ran the LSD experimental program, well, his license was taken off him.
You and Dr. Whitaker are both on record as having been members of the group called The Family. How did that relate to your practice as a psychiatrist? Were you always able to keep that barrier between the two?
At times you had patients who went into yoga classes and then meditation classes and became members of that group. The fact that your practice had a spiritual bias, it wasn't used as a method of recruiting or anything like that. In fact,
Dr. Johnson, the university professor that basically co-founded the cult, well, his reputation was in ruins.
It's been suggested that drugs are used within your group.
This, of course, I deny absolutely.
There's also been some concern about children. Baby farm was an expression.
Well, that's just ridiculous. That kind of nasty allegation, if somebody will come out with it, we'll take action against them.
And Anne and Bill. Anne and Bill, where are they? Well, they're hiding out in New York. They had gotten word that the cult had basically come crashing down and they were laying low. So at the moment, they're in New York and the Australian authorities at this moment cannot touch them. So right now, they're completely untouchable. For now. We do come back round to them though shortly. But first of all, we need to talk about the children because they were in an absolute terrible state. They were malnourished. They were so underweight, but they were just completely terrified and also brainwashed. And remember Cassandra, the poor girl that was so malnourished that she was unable to walk and she was crawling around on her stomach? Well, she was 12 years old when she was rescued and she was in an absolute awful condition. She only weighed 20 kilograms, which is barely over 3 stone. She was also 12 centimeters shorter than average for her age. And it said that she looked like a 4 or 5-year-old, not a 12-year-old. And it turns out that she actually had a diagnosable medical condition, which is called, and this is a tongue twister for me, it is called psychosocial short stature, which is a condition where a child literally stops producing growth hormones because they are living in a stressful environment. And put this girl through so much that she literally stopped growing. And after she was rescued and rehabilitated, she started to grow again. And within a year, Cassandra had grown by 11 centimeters, which is like off the charts growth. And as for the other children, they had to be rehabilitated themselves as well. And the Australian Social Services did an incredible job with all of the children because there were so many of them. And normally when there are so many children, social services will have to split them up. But social services kept all of the children together. They rehabilitated them together. They cared for them. They nurtured them. And with the love and care from the social services, the children were able to turn their lives around. And it's just so happy to think that the children, they were finally being children. They were playing together. They were going to the beach. They were going on outings. They finally started to celebrate birthdays because that's something that I didn't get a chance to touch on, but they didn't celebrate birthdays. They didn't even know when their actual birthday was because Anne would forge their birth certificates. And when they were first rescued, whenever an adult would go near them, they would instantly flinch because previously an adult coming near them would mean punishment. But finally they learned how to live a normal life because it's so sad when you realize how little these children knew. They didn't even know how to cross a road, for example. They didn't even know the basics. They were scared of the refrigerator. They would just stare at it because they were never allowed to get food themselves at the compound. They also finally learned that Anne wasn't their biological mother because their whole life they had thought that Anne and Bill were their biological parents. Well, now they finally learned that that was all a lie. And even though it took far too long, it does make me happy that they were finally shown the love and the attention that they need and deserve. So now we need to revisit Anne and Bill, who are hiding out in New York, because personally, I feel like Anne and Bill need to be extradited back to Australia, locked up, and the key thrown away. But unfortunately, it's not always that simple. Because first of all, Bill and Anne were on the run. They were moving from country to country and authorities didn't actually know where they were. Also, the police struggled to build a case against Bill and Anne, which sounds crazy to me because I'm like, what do you mean you are struggling to build a case? You have all of these children here. They can give evidence of what happened to them. There are all these documents of Anne and all of the things that she did. How are you struggling to build a case? The police interviewed the children. They interviewed Sarah and Leanne, who gave so many details of what happened to them.
It's difficult with dates because our life was sort of, we were brought up in such a stultifying sort of daily routine. Every day was the same, every weekend was the same.
I had been taught that police and other outsiders would hurt us, and that men would want to rape us.
And I was put under arrest for a very long period of time. It was a couple of weeks at least.
I resent not being allowed to go to a normal school and not being allowed to form normal relationships.
Do you want to stop for a while, or do you want to keep trying to go till it's finished?
I'll keep going.
They interviewed the aunties, but of course the aunties denied everything.
It was June. Look at that. From the creek.
Right, and your occupation?
State registered nurse.
Is that your signature?
No comment.
Sorry?
No comment.
Do you recognise that document? It's a photostat document of an original.
No comment.
Other members of the cult were also tracked down and interviewed, but of course, like the aunties, they also denied everything.
Harry Moore's my name, Dr. McKay. I'm wondering if you've got any comment to make now about what happened to the children. Why won't you have... Is that all you've got to say, Dr. McKay? After what you've put those kids through? There's no need for that, Dr. McKay.
And the police actually struggled to find evidence that the children had even been abused. I'm sorry, what? Did we not just talk about Cassandra and the condition that she was diagnosed with? She was quite clearly starved. She was malnourished. Is that not enough evidence of abuse for you? But yeah, the police couldn't find any evidence that the children were abused. They couldn't find any evidence of the children being starved, which again, Cassandra, really? It was too late to find evidence of the children being drugged with LSD because it was obviously not in their system anymore. And also on a lot of the charges, the statute of limitations had passed, which is incredibly infuriating. I could literally do a whole video about how much I hate the statute of limitations. Now listen, I understand statute of limitations. I understand that it is important to have, but I feel like there are some crimes that there shouldn't be a statute of limitations, and those crimes include children. Any crimes against children, there should not be a statute of limitations. It shouldn't matter how much time has passed. You should be able to bring charges on someone. But the investigation kept going. They really did try and build a case. And I will say that the police working on this case, they did try their best, but their hands were tied in a lot of the situation. And they tried to build a case for 5 years. That is how long this investigation went on for. And for those 5 years, Anne and Bill are just living it up in all of their different properties around the world. But then in 1993, Anne slipped up. She made a phone call to Sarah, accidentally revealing her location. She was currently in her mansion in upstate New York, and Sarah told the police told the FBI swooped in and arrested her. And Bill and Anne are finally extradited back to Australia. So once they are in Australia, Anne is held in a prison cell. She has all of her fancy clothes taken away from her, all of her fancy wigs. She no longer has access to her money. She no longer has access to any of her followers. She really has fallen from grace.
Just before 9 o'clock this morning, Victorian police had Anne and William Hamilton Byrne back on Australian soil.
But the case goes to trial. And this is where this case gets infuriating. Even though Anne has committed so many offences, I have lost count. Anne has committed some of the most horrific crimes I have ever heard about. Because let's break it down. She ran a cult for 30 years. She abused the medical system. She got people committed to a psychiatric hospital when they didn't need to be. She stole babies from innocent, young, vulnerable mothers. She raised 28 stolen children and she abused them physically, psychologically, and emotionally for 20 years.
Hamilton Byrne, Mary Moore from Channel 9. You got any comment now about why you kept those children locked away for so long? Why not?
They weren't locked away.
They weren't locked away. You don't call keeping them like children for those years. You got up and you stole the children? You stole them from sect members? Got doctors to organise the adoption?
Excuse me.
We have legal action. It's their rights to say nothing. You have no rights to be asking these things.
Do you think you have spiritual powers?
I don't think I have spiritual powers.
And that is just a very quick breakdown of what she did. She also did a lot of other things. You got to remember how many people she drugged as well. But the prosecution were only able to make one charge stick against her, which was conspiracy to defraud. Let that sink in. Let that sink in. She is only being charged with conspiracy to defraud. And this is basically because she forged the birth certificates of the children, and then the prosecution could only prove that she had forged 3 of the birth certificates. So that is what she was being charged with, forging 3 birth certificates. When I found out that, I was literally screaming. I was so angry. I was like, what the actual hell? You're telling me that she is only being charged with fraud? But that is not the worst of it. Oh no. Bill was also charged with conspiracy to defraud. So Anne and Bill pleaded guilty to this charge. And their punishment, brace yourselves, the punishment for Anne Hamilton Byrne was a $5,000 fine. What? $5,000. $5,000 for everything that she has done. Her punishment is a fine, and she is a multimillionaire. What is $5,000 to her? And then she just walked out of that courtroom a free woman. A few other charges were also brought against the aunties, not for child abuse though. They were charged with committing social benefit fraud. Really? And the aunties received a very short prison sentence. And then they were also released to be free. And you're probably thinking, how the hell did this happen? How did Anne Hamilton Byrne walk free after everything that she has done? Well, apparently there were members of the cult working for Anne that were inside the criminal justice system. And this is how she was able to get away with it. Anne really did have power and influence everywhere. I cannot believe that that is how this case has ended.
The founder of the family religious sect and her husband have been spared jail terms for faking documents which claim 3 children were their own. $5,000 fines were imposed on the couple, and outside the court...
The Hamilton Byrnes escaped a maximum 5-year jail term and $60,000 fine. They had nothing to say about it.
Away on the inadequacies of the legal system. I think that goes without saying. What I would say is I'm very glad it's all over and we can get on with living our lives.
Didn't I tell you that this case would make your blood boil? After everything that these children went through, the fact that they were stolen from their mothers, they never received justice for what happened to them. And then what happened to the cult after the trial? Well, it continued. Even though the kids were rescued, and as far as I'm aware, there were no more children stolen, but the cult just continued and went back to being the leader of her cult. Sarah did actually go on to write a book called Unseen, Unheard, Unknown, where she exposed everything that happened. Also, some of the other children did speak out against Anne, but Anne has always denied everything. Anne even gave an interview and Sarah was also there. And again, I don't know how Sarah was brave enough to go back into a room with Anne.
We didn't have everything that we needed. We had most things. I bought the bigger house because of the likes of little Sarah.
People don't try and take their life because their house is too small.
You're not smart enough.
For what?
In your heart. What's in your heart is not the same.
I don't know what you mean by that.
No, of course you don't.
And the interview is actually on YouTube, so you're going to have to go and watch it after this video, but I will insert some clips. And oh my God, Anne and her little buddy next to her, oh my God, him I want to punch.
All the children made all of this up, did they?
Could be. And they were paid for it. They were paid. You were paid a lot of money.
We weren't paid any money, Michael.
You were certainly paid.
I'm asking. So it didn't happen in your eyes either?
I had a son there.
And how did he go?
Fine.
Was he abused?
No.
And Anne and her little buddy behind her are denying everything and blaming everything on Sarah. And it's so infuriating that even still after all of these years, they are not owning up to anything and they are denying everything.
Did you carry Sarah? Were you her biological mother?
Well, I naturally believe I was. Of course I was.
She has a biological mother.
Do you have DNA to prove it?
The police do, yeah.
No, the police. Do you? Always put it on other people, but do you?
Michael, you're living in a fantasy.
No, I'm not. You're living in a fantasy of pain and deprivation.
Sarah even received death threats from the current cult members.
You're living a lie.
I am not living a lie, Michael.
As far as I'm concerned, you're living a lie. And
because your entire life is a network of lies.
You're suffering for it.
I'm suffering.
We all live lies. We all are living a lie.
What I've suffered in this life is because of what happened up there.
I had a lot of pain.
As long as you blame others, you're nowhere. You're nowhere.
And then 8 years after the court case, Bill passed away. And then in 2004, so 11 years after the court case, Anne was diagnosed with dementia and she was put in a care home. But even still, even though she was in a care home, she still lived a life of luxury because remember, she is a multi-millionaire. And then in June of 2019, so not that long ago, Anne Hamilton Byrne passed away at the age of 98. She had a long, happy life She was very happy. But she left a huge trail of destruction in her wake. She never showed any remorse. She never apologized. She never acknowledged anything that she did.
Why don't you apologise then? It's so easy.
Because I don't believe in you.
Will you apologise to her?
Of course I will. At the right time. If I have to, of course I will.
And in her will, she was still a multimillionaire. She left all of her millions to the other remaining cult members. And as for Anne's biological child, because remember she did have a biological daughter called Judith, I couldn't really find out what happened to her. All I know is that she was estranged from her mother and she changed her name, which was probably for the best. And unbelievably, to this very day, the cult, the family, is still going on. I mean, it hasn't recruited any new members. It's still just the existing members. But yeah, the family is still currently operational. So if you live in Melbourne, look out. Be on the lookout for the family. And the cult is just living off of Anne's millions. And there is one more crazy thing about the cult. So you know Julian Assange, is that how you pronounce his name? Of WikiLeaks. Well, it's strongly rumoured that he was one of the children from the family. Now, Julian denies all of this, but Julian has said that his mom was involved with the family at some point. So who knows? Maybe Julian Assange was one of the children in the family. He definitely looks the part. Oh, and that was the case, the crazy case of Anne Hamilton Byrne and the cult, the family. And Anne really was the worst. Like I said in the intro, she has to be one of the most, if not the most evil women that has ever come out of Australia. And I want to end this video talking about the children and what happened to them as they grew up into adults. Understandably, most of them wanted just normality. They were sick of being different. They were sick of being the children from the family. So a lot of the children have changed their names and they have never revealed their identities because they don't want to be associated with this case. But it is amazing to hear that most of the children are actually still in touch with one another. They pop in and visit each other, they get together for birthdays, and they treat each other like family. They have a deep bond that no one else could understand what they went through. And on the 14th of August, every single year, they celebrate this day as their Freedom Day. And then for the children that have revealed their identities, amazingly and thankfully, most of them have gone on to live very fulfilled lives. Ben Shenton, who was 15 years old when he was rescued, he went on to marry and have 2 children. He is a devoted member of his local church, and he now works as a project manager at IBM. Leanne, who was one of the children that ran away from the home, she also went on to marry and have 2 children, as well as going on to study at university, and she now works in the construction industry. Anna Ree, who was Bill's biological granddaughter, she went on to study film at university. She then taught English in Japan, and she now lives in Australia with her partner and her 2 children. Rebecca, who was Anne's biological grandchild, managed to sue Anne for what she had done and won $250,000. She was also able to turn her life around and also has children of her own. And then finally Sarah, who was the first child that was stolen. And Sarah was crucial in bringing this cult down. She obviously went on to write her book, which is why we know so much about the cult and what happened. And she has worked so hard to raise awareness of what she went through, what the other children went through. Sarah, all she wants was to get the truth out there. Sarah also went on to marry and study medicine at university, then became a qualified doctor and ran her own medical practice, as well as spending a large amount of her time volunteering in India and Thailand, where she has helped displaced refugees, which is honestly incredible. She has literally spent her whole life trying to help people. And what is even more amazing is that Sarah managed to reconnect with her birth mother. And it's just really heartwarming to hear that the children, they managed to turn their lives around. However, every single child that grew up in that cult has been left with scars and trauma that they have to deal with every single day. And we do know that some of the children that were rescued from the cult have taken their own lives because the trauma was just too much, which just absolutely breaks my heart. And finally, Sarah, even though she managed to turn her life around, she still suffered greatly. She had gone through so much. She became addicted to prescription medication, and in 2004 she tried to take her own life. However, the attempt failed, and during the attempt she accidentally injected air into her leg, and this led to complications and she had to have her leg amputated. She then had to live with a prosthetic leg as well as using a wheelchair. And then very sadly, 12 years later in 2016, Sarah suffered from heart failure, and it is thought that the heart failure could have come from complications from when she tried to take her own life. And Sarah very sadly passed away at the age of 46. So even though Anne never took any lives herself with her own hands, she still has blood on her hands, and it's just really heartbreaking to end the video on such a sad note. It just feels like this case, there was no justice served, and I just really hope that all of the children that escaped the family, who are obviously now adults, I just wish them all the best, and I really hope that they're doing okay. And that is the end of this case, which was a heavy one. It really was. I think we all need a break after this case. Wow. And I feel like we all need to go hug our pets after this, if you have them, or your children, or your partner. Just hug someone. And speaking of pets, I have been seeing in the comments that a few of you want to see Daisy again. So hopefully... Thank you. You don't like the taste of the makeup, do you? No. Hopefully Daisy can put a little smile on your face. Oh, Daisy. Oh, thank you. I love you too. I love you. Oh, Daisy Bear. So as always, let me know your thoughts, theories and opinions on today's case. And don't forget to leave me your case suggestions in the comments down below. And I'll see you all in my next video. Bye.